And feel the joy in this place. I would like to invite you to finish grabbing coffee, take a seat as we welcome our Sunday school speaker, Professor Robert Darden. Here we go.
Thank you for those of you who stayed. Some of you are doing a marathon, all three of us today, and I bless your hearts over that. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about my favorite subject. As some of you know, I did a couple books on the music of the civil rights movement. And I want to give a shout out to my wife, Mary, who's sitting down front, who went with me as we spent weeks on the south side of Chicago and the west side of Birmingham in Central City, Memphis, talking to the heroes of the movement. And because I played the song just before we came on, the two books are titled Nothing But Love in God's Water, Black Sacred Music from the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement. And as you could tell how much that song meant to me, it came out of the project itself in that regard. As the music began arriving, all the ancient vinyl, we noticed a disproportionate number of the B-sides. And I don't want to, for you guys who are under 30, have to explain that too. But was about the civil rights movement in the years when it was raging. How brave that must have been to have a record under your arm in Birmingham that said, I believe Martin Luther King was right, or there ain't no segregation in heaven. So that's how this project began. And in about the apparently 30 minutes I have, and I apologize for going over during my sermon, I am Baptist after all. I'll see if I can give you a shortened version of what's a much longer talk on the music of the movement, because it still matters today. And I hope by the end of this you'll agree. The good news is I won't be talking the whole time. From the Black Gospel Music Preservation Project, I've pulled some of the songs, both recordings and some of them recorded live on the actual streets of Selma and Birmingham and Montgomery, that we have amassed among our 60,000 items that we pulled together. But to do that, if you'll indulge me for a moment, I need to go back a little bit further to the spirituals. Because at the root of the vast majority of the known freedom songs are spirituals. And I believe, and I believe most of my colleagues now didn't originally believe, that they perhaps should really be called protest spirituals. Because the act of singing one of these songs in and of itself was an act of protest for a people who were enslaved, who had no rights and whose life was less than the snap of a finger. Robert, next slide, please. So I don't want to go into too much detail on this, but please know ahead of time that the 6,000 or known spirituals were mostly designed to do one of or more of the things on the list you see behind me. They were incredibly rich and varied. When you had writing taken away from you, art taken away, freedom taken away, they stripped everything from the enslaved people, save their music. And in that music, they created the Iliad, they created the encyclopedia, they created a communication form that not only resonates today, that I believe is even more powerful today. And I'm not sure you're going to be able to see the little film clip I'm going to show, but I hope you've had a chance to see the extraordinary movie 12 Years a Slave, about a freedman who was illegally enslaved and finally gained his freedom again. There's a short little clip in the movie that I want to play where the enslaved man, played by the wonderful Chiwetel Ejiofor, is at the funeral of yet another one of his brothers who's been killed. And if you can get a chance to see the movie, watch his face. Because in the course of those 3 minutes, it changes from despair to rage to a hopefulness that the great protest spirituals endowed. So if you can't see the clip while it plays, listen to the music. Robert? Yeah, please do. It's a smile. The first three spirituals on that list, we know from the writings of the great Harriet Tubman, were indeed protest spirituals. She has said that she used those as gathering songs for the midnight meetings where they would spirit people away from the South. Others, we have little pieces. And for a long time, we thought this was a select group of spirituals. But later research is beginning to inform us it may be that every spiritual had this element about it. My favorite one on that list is the Lord can deliver Daniel. But the rest of it is, why not any man? So think of how stupid you have to be a slave owner, standing there in a field, and hundreds of slaves are singing in front of you, if the Lord delivered Daniel, why not any man? And not get it. But a lot of those is what we call, Robert, the next slide please, a double-voicedness to them, where there is a meaning, and Henry Louis Gates is credited for that particular concept, where within a circle, the enslaved people, there was one meaning, but outside the circle, all of the white folks, there was another, usually a much more innocuous meaning. So after the Civil War and after the slaves are temporarily freed, at least in the South, before the Jim Crow laws and Reconstruction crushes their hopes once again, there were many who thought that these spirituals, the protest spirituals, would disappear, but they continue. They continue because there is a need for them. They continue particularly in the Deep South, but as the great migrations begin moving forward, they carry this music with them. They're also carrying the blues and the beginnings of jazz and a number of other art forms with them that will become the foundation of all American popular music. And I think a lot of people don't realize the roots of rock and rap and everything else actually begin with the sacred music of enslaved people from Africa, because the music forms, as musicologists tell us, these distinctives of the African tradition, the flatted sevenths and the thirds, the so-called blue notes that give the blues its name, are a direct survival from Africa. And we are still singing that music today. So after the Civil War, the next step I want to mention just very briefly is that the labor unions have a long tradition of singing labor music, 200, maybe 300 years in some cases from England, and they brought that with them. There are some famous union people said that I only got saved because of the singing in the union, and a singing union is a successful union. And to their discredit, they didn't allow African Americans in until the 1930s when the labor shortages started popping up. But when they did, a combination, very rare, happened between the labor songs and the early protest spirituals. Also, in the case of the blues. So I'm going to pick just one song that we have from the collection that you may not know. We shall not be moved. Like a tree standing by the water, we shall not be moved. That wasn't originally a freedom song. It originally came from both the blues and the labor background. Robert, can you play just a minute of Mississippi John Hurt's version? Much earlier, say from the 19 teens.
I shall not be moved. I shall not be moved, just like a tree planted by the water. I shall not be moved.
Robert, I don't know if you can stop it there since it's on a track, but if you can stop it or hem it for a second for time purposes. You know, it's kind of folky, kind of folk bluesy thing. There's other versions of it. They're more bluegrass country style. But when you put it into the African American tradition, when it joins the Union, then you hear these songs spread out. One of the greatest examples is We Shall Overcome. The earliest versions of We Shall Overcome, probably 1920s and 30s, from the tobacco picker unions, which didn't last long in North Carolina, sound radically different than the one we know today. But that's one of the great geniuses of freedom songs and spirituals. They adapt, they change, and the sound of We Shall Overcome in the beginning, kind of Pete Seeger with that kind of pick and banjo style, as each Memphis movement, Selma movement, Montgomery movement, they give it their own take. And by the time it gets to the last days of the movement, say the Resurrection City in Washington, D.C., it has a number of traditions with it, of clapping, of interjections, and it sounds more like a Memphis soul song in that kind of deep groove that goes to it. So if we can play just a minute of We Shall Not Be Moved, recorded on the streets of Albany. I was been corrected on that. Albany, Georgia. Over there.
We shall not be moved alone. Shall not be alone. We shall not be moved just like a tree that's planted by the water. Oh, we shall not be moved. All the state troopers, we shall not be moved alone. All the state troopers, we shall not.
Got a better beat too. I don't know what that. I do know what that means, but let's not do. Let me go to the next slide, please. So, when you get the labor songs with the protest spirituals come together, and when you realize most of the activity in the early and even to the end of the movement takes place in churches, the mass meetings, you get what we will call the freedom songs. And they are, it's an important fact to remember how important the churches were to the civil rights movement. And to be fair, not all churches. In Birmingham, the great site where Dr. King and spent so much time, only one black church in 10 actually supported it. The others, for whatever reason, maybe safety, who knows, but they stayed back. So you've got 1/10 of the churches, 1/10 of the population, against the entire might of the state of Alabama and, in fact, United States. And yet, they prevail. And I hope in the next few minutes I can convince you why I believe that happened. So that's for the beginnings of the freedom songs. While it is primarily an African-American oral tradition, we do need to shout out a couple of people who worked as traveling evangelist ambassadors, taking these songs from one movement site to the other. Pete Seeger, of course, but on the picture there of Guy and Candy Carawan, a couple white folk singers who realized very early that these songs could be adapted from Albany to Selma, to Montgomery, to Birmingham, up to Chicago eventually, and back down to the tragic day in Memphis. They add, they evolve, some drops out, some expand, but they are a living entity. There is no one definitive version of any spiritual that we know. They changed every night back in antediluvian days. Before the Civil War, they would be sung differently in the same plantation on the same night. They would be sung differently from 1 mile to the next. It's an organic process. The same with the freedom songs, because they inherited that tradition. Next slide, please. One of the things that I do want to bring out is the fact community singing. People singing together have power. The church has known this a couple thousand years, but we didn't, I don't think, really understood it until the church got involved with the unions, and the unions all formed together with the activists to create the civil rights movement, modern civil rights music in the American South. So this next song I'm going to play, imagine you're a white state trooper. Let's say he's my size, mildly overweight, not particularly well educated, standing in Selma, Alabama, with a single rope in front of him, the wall of Jericho, they called it. and there's maybe 1,000 black people on the other side. And you started off pretty much as a racist 10 days ago, but for 10 days, these people have sung to you, prayed for you, told you they loved you, and just love bombed you, and then sang these extraordinary songs day and night in heat and in rain. And maybe you're just wobbling a little bit. So think of this song, 10,000 people singing right at you. So, Robert, if you play the one in the little black corner, thank you.
Oh, freedom.
Turn it way up. This one needs to be loud.
Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. Over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my own grave and go home to my Lord and be free. No more weeping, don't you know? No more weeping. No more weeping over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my own grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Freedom. Freedom over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free.
And just like the spirituals, they used these songs to lift them up when they were down, to encourage them. Also, when they were getting too angry, when some horrible injustice would come, they could use the freedom songs and a spiritual to calm you down. They were used to educate. They were used to tell the names of other freedom fighters in the country and give each other hope. Incredibly versatile music. This next song is just a snippet. I looked a long time to find this one. Somebody had a little handheld recorder at Selma, and this was recorded 2 days before the murder of Jonathan Davis. And it's at that rope I mentioned that they put the black side of town, and because they knew they weren't violent, they only separated them by a single rope. And the white side, the great majority of the town, as they tried to figure out what was going on. And that's on this side of the rope that Edwards was. And when they had one part of town that was supposedly neutral is where he was going with the teenagers to get a Coca-Cola. You can imagine a man with a shotgun looking how dangerous this little frail speckled Episcopal priest and this little 16-year-old must have been, because he pleaded self-defense in the jury of all white peers from Selma and got off scot-free. But his name's lost to history. Jonathan's, we still honor. So that's some of the background on that, as we mentioned, his name is still honored. Just a week or so ago, there was a pilgrimage that followed those very steps and remembered the singing of those songs. Because if you go look at the program from this event, the music is sung at every step. And as Mary and I went throughout the country talking to the survivors of the movement, we wanted to know what they sang, where they sang it, why they sang it, and what they hoped to accomplish. And we sat on little tiny houses and couches covered with plastic and little rooms of people who gave us probably their last cup of coffee. And they couldn't always remember, most of them in their 80s, the sermons that were preached. They couldn't always remember the laws, the legislatures, the hurts they'd endured. But time and time again, they sang these songs to Mary and I. And we got little tiny desk concerts sitting there with some of these extraordinary saints who could remember every word of the songs of liberation that they sang. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry, there's a song on there. Can you play that one? That's the one I meant from you.
Till it fall, it's gonna stay here till it fall in Selma, Alabama.
Build that wall, hey, they that build that wall in Selma, Alabama. Love is the thing that make it fall, make it fall, make it fall. Love is the thing that make it fall in Selma, Alabama. Stand here till it fall, till it fall, till it fall. We're gonna stand here
Till it fall in Selma, Alabama.
The reason I wanted to play this particular little snippet is we have no way of knowing, but there is every chance that Jonathan Daniels is in that group singing that, because he was part of all the singing that went on. His voice is somewhere in there. And that just moved me when I figured that out from the dates. Next slide, please. One more big song before we kind of wrap this up here. You know this one. But to know it as a white person is really different than to know it as a black person. Because as I did the books on the music of the civil rights movement, it took me to the many sermons of Dr. King and Dr. Abernathy and Dr. Shuttlesworth, the other heroes. And as I listened to them, I heard spiritual and freedom song and hymn after hymn mentioned over and over again. It was part of the fabric of these sermons. It was a shared language that even the sympathetic white reporters didn't quite get. And as I've teased out King's sermons, and he has one where he mentions more than 40 different songs in just a 7-minute sermon, that you realize they're not singing these lightly. And as we interviewed the people in particularly Birmingham about the mass meetings, they would say they would start gathering at 3 p.m. for a 7 o'clock meeting. And I said, what would you do? I said, well, we sang. And I said, well, who led you? And they laughed at me. You don't need a leader. That's a white people thing. You don't need a leader. Somebody would lift up this song. We had to get there at 3 to get a good seat. And as it got closer and closer, and the different movement leaders who would generally arrive at the last moment because they were trying to keep the police from knowing where they were. You remember, black people call Birmingham Bombingham. There had been 37 bombings by this point, including a handful of churches, and King's Home, and Shuttlesworth's Home. Would show up, and there would be maybe 15, 20 minutes of instruction. I need 30 people downtown, Selma, Birmingham, to get arrested. I need us to raise money here. Then there would be the sermon by one of these great saints for maybe 30, 45 minutes. Short sermon, just to get juices going. Then they would sing, and they'd sing for another 2 hours. So since 3 o'clock, they have been singing nonstop. Now, you don't invest that kind of time in something unless you believe there is some kind of return for that. Either immediate return or a return in the future. Singing is part of the DNA of this movement. So, not that we haven't heard it, but let's hear it one more time, is that not that they can sing "We Shall Overcome," but that they must sing it. Robert? We shall overcome. That's a very intentional choice of that word. And the original version was "I shall overcome," way back when it was a black hymn in the 1920s. We shall overcome. And you hear the voices behind them singing hallelujah. In some of the versions later, there's a very intricate rhythmic clapping that goes along with it. But to end, notice that the right hand over the left hand in the cross. That is how it's done at every black service Mary and I have ever been to. That's very intentional. And if the camera had pulled back, you'll see black and white people in there. You can sing it too. The freedom songs, the spirituals, were created and sung by the oppressed. Yes, Elon Musk can sing them, but I'm not sure God is pleased. They are sung not by the people in power, but by the people who are oppressed. That's why they're powerful, even through to this day. Next slide, please. So I had finished the books, the second volume, Nothing But Love in God's Water, Black Sacred Music from Sit-ins to Resurrection City, and I should have been elated. That had been a 5-year slog, a lot of travel that we had spent. But if you know the story of Resurrection City, you know it ended in pretty much disaster. On the mall in Washington, D.C., in the rain, and people defecting, and by then there had been a strong black power movement who were wondering if the spirituals and freedom songs should even be sung. King had been assassinated, and that's not where I wanted to end that book. And it was my son, who's a musician, who loved heavy metal music, said, "Dad, you realize, of course, that the Scorpions," that's a heavy metal band from Germany, by the way, sang "We Shall Overcome" at the fall of the Berlin Wall. No, I didn't know that. And I began looking, and I found out that the Arab Spring, people who are not black, who are not Christian, not only are singing "We Shall Overcome" as they one by one in the Arab Spring throwing off their oppressors, they're making comic books up. They're making t-shirts and posters with freedom songs on them in English. And then in the Hong Kong Umbrella Revolution a few years later, you may remember that, same thing. They began singing the freedom songs. Next slide, please. From the Berlin Wall and to even Tiananmen Square, where you remember the extraordinary photo of the young students standing on that giant flare in front of a long line of tanks. They sang it. Next slide. And it goes on to the Black Lives Matters, to the women's movement, all of these, the Me Too, every one of them, we have heard these songs sung by people too young to have grown up with these, that their grandparents had known them. They are still being sung, and they are still transforming lives. Well, in the minute I have left, next slide, please. One last story. You may know occupied Tibet has long wanted to be freedom from the Chinese communists and such. When they put together the first Women's World Cup, the women in occupied Tibet, most of whom were living in India and Nepal, wanted to put together a soccer team. Soccer's big. And with virtually no money in those high, 5-mile high mountains on rocky fields, playing barefoot in the snow, they put together a refugee Tibetan women's soccer team. And they really worked at it. Some women played with their children on their backs. And they started scheduling the soccer teams from the different countries near Tibet, Nepal, Bhutan, India, Pakistan, and they won. They won enough that they qualified for the very first Women's World Cup. You remember that? And the day came for the big announcement from the fat cats who controlled it, and they were not included in the list. And it turns out that the Chinese government said, we won't participate if occupied Tibet participates. So a BBC reporter was there at the practice field that day where the women were on their battered bus that had been donated to them. And he was the one that had to break the news to them. And I talked to this reporter, and he choked up even telling me. So the women heard the news and didn't say anything. They all turned to get back on their bus to go back to the refugee camp. And you can still hear this on the BBC radio somewhere. And they began singing, "We Shall Overcome." And they kept singing till that bus disappeared into the mist at the top of the mountain. And he stood there, he said, in tears, holding that mic. These songs, now I don't know Episcopal theology as well as I should. I don't know if you use the word anointed. But in my tradition, we do. I believe these songs are anointed. They survive because all the dross has been burned away. All that's left is the gold, the lyrics that have transformed lives and changed America. All of the music that survives, anybody can sing, instantly memorable. And the people who make fun of these, as I saw in Congress not recently, a group of people laughing at some of the black coalition singing it after a particularly horrendous vote on voter registration. There will be a reckoning because these songs that Jonathan sang, that the generations of enslaved people sang, but people still sing today, are here because God wills that they be here, because they change hearts and they change lives.